Hello, everybody. Okay, so here we are for our last hour, last episode, part five of the British Empire and its complexities. So, in this fifth hour, we start off by talking about Suttee, Suttee, which was an Indian custom, and this was basically like the tradition of when a man died in the Indian culture. And I don't think this was for all India because I know India is very mixed in its culture, so it might have just been like some part of India. The wife, the widow, had to kill herself, had to be burnt, right? So the British didn't like this, and they basically stopped this in like 1829. So it talks about the empire doing good by force if necessary, right? Which I think is kind of funny. Yeah, because it's like we go back to the earlier hours of this documentary where they talked about how, the British didn't rule directly, govern explicitly over the colonies, but they told the local leader tribes advice, or they gave them advice that could not be ignored, right? So basically, like, do it or else. So we go here to, yeah, and again, this notion of like maybe it was because as a little island, you had to travel, right? Like literally, even if you wanted to go to like Europe from Britain, you still had to travel. Anywhere you wanted to go, you had to cross the sea. So that, if it's like, well, we're here in France, we might as well just go further and see what's over there, right? So here we go to Malawi, Africa in 1861, which is known as the Dark Continent. Now, I think this is one of the most emotional hours of the documentary because they start off by talking about David Livingstone. And David Livingstone was a good guy. He wanted to abolish slavery. He's the first one to cross Africa. He was a physician. He was a missionary, a Christian missionary. And they talk about how Christianity and free trade were the two Victorian obsessions, Christianity and commerce, right? So, what David Livingstone does is he ends up going to Africa, and obviously diseases hit them hard, right? Because he's not just there for a little bit, and he's just not there living like in the bungalow houses. Like he's actually with the tribes, right? And a lot of his followers die of hunger and disease in Africa. His story is really sad. In 1865, Livingstone vanishes, right? He just vanishes for like 3 years, and he's found again in 1868. I think his mission was basically to help out like all Africa to convert like all the Africans, not by force. Like he like I said, he was genuinely a good guy. I think he had like a slave at one point, and he set him free because he again he didn't believe in slavery. He didn't want that. He just wanted to help, like genuinely help. But he died, and I think that was super sad because when he died, he kind of like gave up. I think in a way he gave up because he didn't really. He saw that what he was doing wasn't really. I think that's why he vanished in 1865 because he saw that his work wasn't really giving fruitful outcomes or results. So I think he just kind of abandoned himself, and he was just like, you know what, I'm giving up, and that's super sad. In 1874, he dies in 1873, I believe, in May 1st of 1973. But news travels slow back then, so I think by 1874 there were a lot of mourners, thousands, because he represented, for the British Empire, he represented more than greed and domination, which was kindness, goodness, right? He represented, it was about doing good. And he's buried in Westminster Abbey, considered the patron saint, the de facto or informal patron saint of the empire. That's not an official title, but like Jeremy Paxman goes there to the Westminster Abbey church, and he notices how there are statues of like important people, and they don't have a statue of him. Like his burial ground is just in the middle of the church, right? Like on the ground, it says like David Livingstone, and it gives the information on him, and they say they did that on purpose because he was the heart of the empire, which I think was pretty cool. So yeah, they talk about the Church, I think, of Scott and missionaries, how they're still teaching kids in Africa and Malawi. This school is called I'm not gonna pronounce this correctly, but it's Nkolokati, I think, the Koloraki Primary School, founded in 1935. So it's still running. The Malawi government does help like administrate it, but it's also backed up by by a Scottish charity, and basically they give the kids there an education and breakfast. So this is like that idea of like, there were missionaries, there were people helping out, but where missionaries led, the traders followed, right? So it's like, okay, you're helping these people out, now let's see how we can make money here, right? um, they talk about the African Lakes Company in 1882, how they traded ivory and cotton. And then we go to 1893, which they talk about William Livingstone. Now, William Livingstone, I think, was a descendant of David Livingstone, but he was like the complete opposite. William Livingstone was a harsh settler. He would do floggings on the slaves, which was beating them with a whip. And for this, we have his, like the counterpart, which is the Reverend John Chilembwe. Chilembwe was a Malayan reverend, and he wasn't going to take this, right? So he believed in all people are created equal, right? And Africa for Africans. Basically, what happens is a fight for Africa in 1915. And I think on the 23rd of February, they end up, the Malawians, in this like type of rebellion, they end up cutting off William Livingstone's head. As retaliation, the British destroy Reverend John Chilembwe's church, and they kill Chilembwe. But he stays a hero. He's even on the currency of the country, I believe. So this is just like an example of, like the harsh things that were happening in these colonies during the British Empire. There's a lot of racism, obviously, in 1863, like with James Hunt. And these racist ideas get muddied up, they say, with Darwin's theory, right? That whites have to rule over blacks. And they talk about, I think, Cecil Rhodes. So I didn't know this. Cecil Rhodes in 1871 named what would become later Zimbabwe, called it Rhodesia, or something like that. And he wanted to invade Africa like harshly, right? Again, we have to remember that there were these viceroys, or eventually called district officers, like they mentioned Todd, a decent chap, 24 years old, and he rules over these African villages, right? So they had the function of being the police, the tax collector, the enforcers, the legislators, like whatever needed to be done, they were in charge, right? And again, we go back to this notion of a decent chap. Now, we already know the situation with Kenya from my previous videos, because they talked about it earlier, how the British were merely bluffing, right? And it was just an indirect rule. Like local rulers were bribed. The British really controlled everything behind the scenes. And what this guy says here, Ted Allegny, I think, he says it's all about trust. So the government has to infiltrate itself into the colonies, or needed to do this eventually, to maintain safety for trade, right? He says there can't be free trade if there's not someone to enforce it, right? Like I'll mention it again. I think I've already mentioned it, but they say the wise constraints that make men free, right? Like this one guy said in one of the videos I already showed here. So the British bluff in the 20th century is called, right? The world turns against imperialism, like in Kenya. And this is because like the British had a sense of, since we're working the land, since we're administrating it, they felt that they could also claim it. So that's kind of like, You know, if you're over here doing good for the people, just do good and get out, or do good, you could stay, but you don't have any power. But of course, they weren't going to do that because they would say, well, and it's kind of like a sense of entitlement. I mean, it does feel justified to say, well, I've come, I've helped, now I need something in return, right? But that in return sometimes is excessive, right? There's no limit on how much you can have. You're just gonna want more and more because you feel you're entitled to it. So yeah, their bluff gets called, and we have a resistance movement which uses terror called the Mao Mao in the 1950s. I think it lasted from 1952 to 1960. And this was basically Kenyans versus Kenyans. Now, if you remember to the first video where I mentioned how the British didn't have enough British people to fight, so they hired like local people, paid local people to fight against the enemies, which the enemies were the own people, right? So, like in India, they arrived to India, they paid local Indians, excuse me, to fight against other local Indians, which were against the British being there. So this happened in Kenya. You know, the British hired Kenyans to fight against the Kenyans that are against the British, right? And the Kikuyu suffered again in 1953. Even the people that were loyal to the British, they burned their huts and they axed people. This happened in the village of Lari. And then we go to the notion of uhuru, which means freedom, I think in Swahili. So yeah, basically by the end of the 1960s, the colonies in Africa slowly gained their independence, and the British Empire is basically dissolved, right? And they do talk about, you know, the good and the bad. I wanna just make a conclusive remark here in talking about the empire, how it brought education. They say it did bring education to the colonies. And it's like, yeah, but what is education really for? Now, there's this very interesting TED Talk, highly recommended. I think maybe I've recommended it before. It's by Sugata Mitra, and it's called Build a School in the Cloud. Or you could also look it up as Hole in the Wall. Now, what this TED Talk eventually gets into is how to improve education, how to develop critical thinking, how to make students actually learn and not just feed them information. And that's all very interesting. But I think the most interesting part of this TED Talk is the beginning, where he actually opens up by talking about how education, or the current education system came to be, which is actually British Empire influenced, right? So like I mentioned, I think in video 3, part 3, the British needed people to be able to do all of this commerce that was happening in the world, right? And there we didn't have the technologies that we do now back then. So what they needed was for people to effectively communicate with each other and with one another across, you know, like big expansive territories. And in order to do this, they needed people with the same type of knowledge, right? So if you look at the education system, everybody learns the same thing, right? And that's because the British Empire designed it that way. They wanted everybody to learn the same things, so everybody knew the same things, and when they communicated with one another, they were able to understand each other and more efficiently and effectively do things, right? Now, that's the education system we inherited and we still continue to use nowadays. We have a classroom full of students, we teach them the same things, and they go out into the world to effectively communicate with one another, right? And that's thanks to the British Empire. So my controversial comment here, or question, would be, was it really that good? I mean, is education really that good? Now, you can say it takes you places, it helps you further develop, yes, if you know where you're going, but what if you don't, and you just become a copy of the machine, of the system, right, of the empire, which now we could say we have a global empire that's not really run by anybody, or maybe it's still run by the spider's web in the city of London, who really knows? But the thing is that, you know, even education has that dark past where it was really used in order to get people to work together, you know, efficiently. but not so much to develop critical thinking or your own understanding of the world and further develop your ideas. No, it was just for you to be able to work the same as as the other people that were working with you, right? As your coworkers, your colleagues, whatever. So yeah, check out that TED talk. Very interesting, especially at the beginning, and you see really just how much influence the British Empire had. Now, I think my conclusive remarks here of the documentary is that I like the part where they go all over. I think I already mentioned that, where they go all over the world. They travel to different places. They interview different people. I didn't really like it. I didn't really like the fact that they just focus. I mean, it is called the Empire. It's not called, Britain's history in general. So I should have known it was only going to focus on the Queen Victorian times. I would have preferred it to have gone like further past in history and even into like the last 70 years. Like, what has the British Empire done these past, they say like things end, like the Soviet Union. They say, yeah, the Soviet Union was dismantled in 1989. But what has happened these last 30 years? I'm pretty sure it's still the Soviet Union. Just because it changes its name, right, doesn't mean that culturally it has changed. So the same thing with the empire, right? Just because after World War II colonies gained their independence, they don't really have control over that, doesn't mean that they have really, doesn't mean that the empire has really lost control. They could still hold control in other ways, like I was mentioning the spider's web from the City of London, which says that the banks or the bank in the City of London control all of the, like, most of the world's money. There's a documentary on YouTube called The Spider's Web. Check it out. Very interesting. But yeah, it would have been interesting for the documentary to have gone like way to the past and into the present to kind of like, I think the documentary came out in 2011, something like that. So they could have done something like that, which they didn't. They just finish off in the 60s and start talking from, like, they talk about some parts in the 1600s, but they basically focus in like the late 1700s, early 1800s, all the way to 1960s, post World War II. What else? Yeah, I would have liked them to have gone deeper. I guess like the whole jumping around thing, like they would go from one year to the future and then to the past and then to this place and then to that place and then back again to this place, right? Like they went to Kenya and India a bunch of times throughout. I think in the first hour they go to India. They start off with India and then they go back to India like in hour 3 or 4 or something like that, with Gandhi in hour 5 or 4. I think it was 4. So I would have liked them to have like a little bit more order. I don't know if I'm just used to that. Maybe that's too much to ask, or I'm just being self-entitled by saying I wish they would have given me an order. But historically and plays wise, I would, if you do need to go back, like go back just to tie in like something, or like if you're like, okay, we're gonna start out in the 1800s, 1700s, the spice trade, and then when we get to like the Gandhi era, we'll go back to India, okay, but there's at least an order of events, maybe not of places, the jumping around places wouldn't have been a big deal if there would have been order in the time, right? And with time, like, okay, we're gonna start off with the 1600s, everything that happened in the 1600s, everything that happened in the 1700s, everything that happened in the 1800s, everything that happened in the 1900s, right? And then the 20th century, that would have been just fine. But it kind of jumped around. It kind of talked about characters here and there. So I felt like that was kind of weird. It was kind of, okay. And that's why my review is like that, because it just jumped around all over the place. Now, could I have organized it? Maybe, but that would have been more work. So, yeah, these 5 videos were 2 weeks in the making. I spent the first 3 days, I think, just watching the videos. And it was kind of hard work because, it's just like 2 hours the first day, Monday, of a video. And then the second day was an hour and a half. And then the third day was the other hour and a half. And meanwhile, I was taking notes, and I just reviewed the notes before making each video so I could talk to you about them and put some pictures and images here. So I hope you enjoyed my review. That's all I got for this video and for this section. So we close off this section, and be on the lookout for my other videos if you enjoy it. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.